Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Seth Monahan, and I have been having an awesome year. How about you? Well, despite everything, I'm still a professor of music theory, and this is still the best place on the internet to learn how classical music works. So how about this? Take a break from whatever is stressing you out and learn a little bit about tonic pedal points. So what does that mean? Well, a pedal point is some note in a texture that holds firm in place while other stuff goes on around it. And since they're usually in the bass voice, we're really talking about a bass note that stays put while the other voices keep moving above it. The term itself comes from the world of organ music, where we often find long bass notes played not by the performer's hands, but by their feet on, like, actual pedals. Here's a passage from Bach's A minor prelude and fugue, and notice how the player just jams that A natural for bar after bar while all kinds of crazy business goes on in the upper staves. That is literally a pedal point, though nowadays we use the term to describe any fixed bass note, regardless of the instrument or whether it's played by human feet or not, because it's usually not. Now, a few important things before we dive in. First, I need you to know that pedal points in this style are almost always on one of two notes, scale degrees 1 or 5. We just saw Bach use scale degree 1. Second, if you've watched my whole video series, it might be helpful to think about how today's topic is different from the one in video 23, which also focused on voices moving over a stationary bass. Here is the example we started with in that lesson. And as you may remember, the point of video 23 was to help us understand that in cases like this, the moving upper voices were really only melodic embellishments, and that there was, quote unquote, really only one chord per bass note, tonic and then dominant. Today is different. Today, we're going to hear what sound, to me at least, like actual full-blown chord changes with their own harmonic functions over a frozen bass note. And what we'll find is that many of these chords clash sharply with the pedal point itself, mainly because the pedal point is often not a part of the chord. So we're going to hear some pretty crunchy sounds today, like this one. And yet, despite that kind of surface dissonance, tonic pedal points also do the important work of anchoring the tonic in our ear. That's why we almost always find them either at the very beginning of pieces or at the ends of sections after a strong cadence. And finally, I want to point out that the idioms we're going to learn today require a different kind of listening than what I've been teaching you until now. Normally, in this style, bass lines move. They're melodic. They lock into a contrapuntal dance with the other voices. And how they move tells us a lot about the harmony we can expect to find above. That's why we've spent the past 13 videos listening carefully to bass lines above all else. But today, we're going to hear bass lines not moving at all. Think about this. We're going to learn a bunch of different progressions today, and all of them have exactly the same bass line, tonic, just standing still. So we're going to need to focus our hearing on what makes them different from each other, which is what happens above, specific melodic lines, particular changes of tension, and so on. So a quick overview of what's in store today. We're going to start with simple away and back progressions in both major and minor. First, we'll see 1 go to 4 and back over a tonic pedal. Then 1 goes to 5, 7 and back over a pedal. And finally, we'll see 1 go to 7 diminished 7 and back over a tonic bass. Then we're going to look at complete functional cycles, tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic, that happen over tonic pedals. And we'll close with situations that combine some of these options. So let's start with motions to 4 and back again over a tonic pedal. Here is the slow movement from Schubert's second piano trio. And notice that the bass barely moves here. There's a tonic vamp at the opening, punctuated by a few throwaway 4 chords. And the only other bass motion is at the very end of the phrase when we get a quick PAC. But the progression that interests us is in bars 3 through 5. There, I'm going to use this notation to show that whatever happens here happens over a tonic pedal. And what happens is that we go from 1 to a 4 chord and then back again. Now I want to talk for a second about how we label that middle chord, because there's actually a few options in this case. Because the C natural bass is part of the 4 chord, we could have just labeled this as 4-6-4 and left out the pedal point altogether. That's how we did it back in video 20, actually. But if we do have the pedal point symbol there, we don't need to use the figure bass since we already know what the bass note is. And to be consistent, I'm going to use this notation in all of our examples since the pedal point isn't usually a chord tone at all. Anyway, one more quick thing here. To help you hear today's progressions, I'm going to tease out some common upper voice motions that often give them away. In this case, we find it in the top of the piano part. Notice here how scale degrees 5 goes up to 6 and then back again. When that happens, and when the middle chord isn't particularly dissonant, you may well be hearing a motion to 4 and back. And of course, Schubert doesn't want us to miss this, so he hides that same motion in the cello part as well. The first bar gives us scale degree 5, and then the second bar starts and ends on A flat, scale degree 6, which then goes back to 5 again. Have a listen. Here is a much more famous example of the same progression from the opening of Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. For the first 4 bars, the tonic is in the bass on every downbeat. It starts with 2 bars of 1, then we go to 4, and then back again. And if you look up at the melody, there's a really audible motion from scale degree 6 back down to scale degree 5. And if we want to test our long-range hearing, we can even hear that C, scale degree 6, linking up to the B that starts the phrase, making the whole thing a kind of expanded B, C, B motion. Here's how it sounds with the next 4 bars, which take us to a half cadence. This next example is from the opening of Haydn's second cello concerto, and I picked it because it shows a much more embellished version of this same progression, but one that's still built around this 5-6-5 motion above the bass. To start, notice that it's a sentence with a double continuation. Basic idea repeats, continuation leading to an IAC, and then finally the same music now leading to a PAC. And the tonic pedal itself sits under the 2 basic ideas. The first basic idea is just a tonic chord embellished with some passing tones, and it tops off right at scale degree 5. Then the repetition starts on 4 and moves back to 1 with some gorgeous parallel thirds moving downward from an appoggiatura, connecting scale degree 6 back to scale degree 5. So here's how the whole thing sounds. So just one more. This is the slow movement from Haydn's last piano trio. It starts with a long tonic pedal, and above it, the harmony goes to 4 and back, not once, but twice. But what makes this one special is the melody. It's not hard to find our 5-6-5 schema here. Each new tonic chord puts scale degree 5 right in the melody, And 2 of those are directly preceded by scale degree 6, just a step above. But look at how we get from 5 to 6. Haydn starts by leaping up to B, then using a passing A sharp to bridge the chord change and approach scale degree 6 from above. But A sharp is dissonant against both chords, particularly the 4 chord. So with this melody, he's able to make the 4 chords a lot tenser and more expressive than they might usually be. So now let's pivot over to away and back progressions that use 5/7 over a tonic pedal. Here is a high energy theme from Beethoven's First Symphony, and it starts with 8.5 bars of tonic pedal, with chord changes every 2 bars. Tonic, then 5/7, and tonic again, 5/7 again, and finally tonic. And notice here that I'm not showing these 5/7 chords in any kind of inversion. That's because the whole concept of chord inversion is irrelevant here. To say a chord is inverted is to say that some chord tone other than the root is in the bass, but here the bass is scale degree 1, which isn't even part of the 5 chord. So it's not appropriate to be asking what quote-unquote inversion of 5/7 this is. We just write 5/7 over a tonic pedal. And the other thing to notice here is that each change of harmony emphasizes either the tonic or the leading tone in the melody. Look at the odd numbered downbeats. You've got tonic, then the leading tone, then tonic, leading tone, and finally tonic again. I don't think this is a coincidence. Of all the notes in the dominant, the leading tone is the one that's most dissonant against the tonic bass. So by building this melody on a scaffolding of tonics and leading tones, Beethoven really helps us hear those changes of function above the pedal point. When we listen, try actually singing along with the bass pedal point. It'll help you really feel that characteristic rub of the dominant chords against the tonic bass. Here is the same progression in an even more famous piece, the opening of Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik. Now, maybe you've heard this before, but if not, it starts with a theme in bare octaves, outlining tonic for 2 bars. And then responds with 5/7 for 2 more bars. Then we break into a full texture, and that's where we find a tonic pedal. And it's actually very similar to the Beethoven we just heard. We alternate tonic and dominant twice, with the melody, again, emphasizing scale degrees 1 and 7 at each chord change. Have a listen. Now, if you're wondering if this sort of thing happens in minor, the answer is, of course it does. Here's the opening of Mozart's K310 Piano Sonata. The main theme is a sentence, basic idea, and continuation. And like the Haydn Cello Concerto we heard a few minutes ago, there's a tonic pedal under both basic ideas. But now we see a simple alternation of 1 and 5/7 over that pedal. And as far as the melody goes, we don't get much emphasis on scale degree 1, but when we land on 5/7 each time, the leading tone is in the melody, like in the last 2 examples. Here's how it sounds. Now let's go up a half step into one of my favorite keys, B flat minor. This one's from the opening of Chopin's First Nocturne, and hopefully you can hear that alteration in the accompaniment. Rather than simply take this harmonization for granted, I want you to actually think about how different it would sound if we just had a normal inverted dominant here. So listen carefully to this bass note. This is what Chopin wrote. And this is what he could have written. When you have the bass move into that tendency tone, it really undermines the tranquility that I think Chopin is going for here. So our last example in this section is definitely my favorite. It's the 24th and final song in Schubert's cycle Winterreise. And literally the entire song, almost 4 minutes of music, is just alternations of tonic and dominant over a pedal point. The bass literally never moves. And the effect is very creepy and very calculated because the song describes an encounter with death who takes the form of an old man playing a barrel organ on a lonely road in wintertime. And at the end of the song, we're supposed to understand that the protagonist of the cycle has finally frozen to death. So you could hardly come up with a simpler or more brilliant way to set the mood with harmony that sounds like it's actually frozen and lifeless. So the last 3 chord progression we're going to hear goes from tonic to 7 diminished 7 and back. You're looking at a passage from Haydn's Farewell Symphony from the very end of the exposition after a big PAC. We're in C sharp minor here, and just like all the examples with 5-7, we go to a dominant twice and then come back to tonic. But now the dominant is way more dissonant. Here's the progression with just regular 5-7. And here's what Haydn wrote with 7 diminished 7. It's only a 1-note difference, but it adds real ferocity to the passage, especially with the sforzandos. Now, you might be surprised to learn that we see this same progression all the time in major keys as well. This is the end of Schubert's wonderful song Nacht und Träume, and from the cadence to the double bar, we've got a pedal on the tonic B and 2 motions to 7 diminished 7, which has G natural in it. That's flat scale degree 6. And again, to really hear what makes this progression special, we should just compare it to a regular old 5-7. Here's what Schubert's last 2 bars would sound like with just a vanilla 5-7. It's pretty, but here it is with 7 diminished 7, which brings a touch of romantic melancholy. I hope you can hear the wonderful color change that chromatic G natural brings. Schubert definitely puts it in the foreground by having it in octaves on all the offbeats. Here's the whole passage. Here's one more example from another top 40 crowd pleaser, Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker. Each of the 2 phrases here moves to 7 diminished 7 and back. And again, listen to what it loses if we swap out that 7 diminished 7 chord for a vanilla 5-7. Yuck. Ugh. We have to have that B flat in there. So now we're going to look at slightly longer progressions, ones that include complete functional cycles over a tonic pedal. Here is the slow movement from Haydn's second Opus 71 string quartet, and it's got a bar of tonic, a bar of predominant, a bar of dominant, and another bar of tonic all over a tonic pedal. We see this all the time at the opening of Baroque and classical pieces, and one of its melodic signatures is a stepwise ascent from scale degree 5 up to tonic. And Haydn makes this especially clear. The first three downbeats are scale degree 5 over tonic, scale degree 6 over predominant, scale degree 7 over dominant, and then at the end of the phrase we finally get to the tonic again. Have a listen. Here's another example of this from the classical period. It's Beethoven's first Opus 14 piano sonata. Not only does it use exactly the same chords, it also features the same rising melodic line in two different capacities. We see it most clearly in the top of the pianist's left-hand block chords. But it's also there in the melody, laid out exactly like the Haydn we just heard. Scale degrees 5, 6, and 7 are all on successive downbeats, and then the tonic arrives in the middle of the fourth bar. One hears this sort of opening all the time in Bach. Here's the opening to the first solo cello suite, and it's the same thing. Bar of tonic, bar of predominant, this time 4, a bar of dominant, now just 7 diminished, and then back to tonic. But it's different in that the rising 5, 6, 7, 1 line is in an inner voice now. The top voice moves from scale degree 3 to 4 and back. And here's the same thing in the C minor prelude from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. This one uses 4 for a predominant and 7 diminished 7 as the dominant. It also has a variant of the melodic skeleton we keep hearing. Instead of rising from 5, Bach starts on tonic, leaps down to scale degree 6, then rises through the leading tone up to tonic. Here's how it sounds. And for our last complete cycle, we'll fast forward 170 years back to the Nutcracker, this time to the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies. This passage has a 4-bar vamp and then a 4-bar theme, and all of it is over a tonic pedal. And the vamp has a 2-bar functional cycle that includes an applied chord. He gives us tonic, 2 diminished, 7 diminished 7 to 5, then 7 diminished 7. And the cool thing about that applied chord is that it helps Tchaikovsky create a winding chain of parallel thirds that move by step. B and G, go to C and A, then up to C sharp, A sharp, and then back to A and C, and then the whole thing happens again. Now, the vamp actually continues under the first part of the theme itself. But then Tchaikovsky breaks off into a chain of descending diminished 7th chords, capped off by a dominant resolution and then a little plagal tag. So now, as promised, I'll wrap up with a handful of examples that mix these pedal point progressions in all kinds of ways. We're looking at the opening of Der Greise Kopf, another song from Schubert's Winterreise. And it's only 4 bars long, but in that time, the melody traces a huge 2.5 octave arc, and one that matches the rise and fall of harmonic tension. It starts at middle C over tonic. It then rises up a fifth as we move to 5/7 over tonic, and then climaxes on 7 diminished 7 over tonic, with the melody leaping by tritone into that high A flat. It then arpeggiates downward and relaxing back into the tonic at the end. Something I especially love here is the unapologetically nasty voicing of the 7 diminished 7 over tonic. Schubert could have put the chord tones in the pianist's right hand, which gives you a dissonant chord, but not one as grotesque as the sound of all 5 notes jammed into the bass clef. Here's how it sounds. Here's another spooky minor mode example. This is from one of Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words for solo piano, and it features 2 away and back motions from tonic. After a bar of tonic vamp, the melody comes in with 5/7 over tonic, which then resolves. And it wraps up with a minor 4 over tonic, which again relaxes back into the 1 chord. Notice how neither of these chords is anywhere near as spiky as the 7 diminished 7 from the last example. There's a very muted coloring in this passage that I love. Now, here's a very different sort of passage from a piece that people used to think was by Mozart, but now don't really. Well, whoever wrote it starts the theme off with a sort of sentential call and response gesture, which moves from tonic to 5/7 and then back, and then launches into a whole functional cycle over tonic. Here's how it sounds. And our very last example is also by Mozart, except this one is actually by Mozart, like for real. It has 6 bars of tonic pedal and then a 2-bar cadence formula. And before we even look at the individual chords, you should notice that the melody has a really high density of non-chord tones, all those red notes, especially in the second half. And unlike a lot of the examples we've heard already, this is one where the melody doesn't consistently help us follow the harmony, but the inner voices make the chord changes clear enough. The first system alternates tonics and dominants. But then ends with a chord we haven't seen before. It's a dominant 7th chord whose root is the tonic. This is actually 5/7 of 4, and it's going to be the star of video number 30. For now, let's just note that it does what we'd expect. It resolves to 4, which itself resolves to tonic twice over a pedal, leading us right into the cadence. This is probably one of my favorite excerpts in the whole video. So that, my friends, is all you need to know, and as usual, probably a lot more than you needed to know about tonic pedal points. Coming up next is video number 30, which does a deep dive on applied chords to 4. Until then, be safe be smart, and please wear a mask.